We have sustained losses, but let me be clear. Our resolve is unbroken, and we will retaliate with overwhelming force.
Move! Get off the ramp! Go, get to cover!
Gentlemen, our objective remains control of the Solomons. We push east at dawn. Secure the perimeter immediately. Make way for the commanding officer. Today, we stand at the culmination of our long struggle. The promise made generations ago is finally realized.
We are here to sign the instrument of surrender. Let the procedure begin.
On March 11, 1942, Douglas MacArthur left the Philippines. He did not leave voluntarily. He left under direct order from President Roosevelt, who had decided that the general commanding the defense of the Philippines could not be allowed to be captured or killed when the Philippines fell. And the Philippines, by March of 1942, were going to fall. The Japanese forces that had been advancing since December had the Bataan Peninsula surrounded. The supply situation was hopeless. The reinforcements were not coming. Bataan would hold for another month, and then it would not hold, and the men on it would surrender or die. MacArthur had argued against leaving. He had proposed, at various points, leading a breakout attempt with a small force, or staying to fight alongside his men, or simply refusing to go. He was overruled. He was ordered out, and he went by torpedo boat through Japanese patrol waters to Mindanao, then by aircraft Australia. He arrived in Australia on March 17, 1942, and at a press conference in Adelaide, he said the words that would define his image of the rest of the war and the rest of his life. I came through and I shall return. He shall return. Not we, not the United States Army, not the Allied forces. He, that pronoun, that specific choice of first-person singular, is the key to understanding Douglas MacArthur. It was not accidental. MacArthur was the most self-consciously theatrical general in the American military, possibly in any military, and every word he said in public was calculated for effect. The effect he was calculating in Adelaide was the creation of a personal commitment, a personal promise, that would bind him to the Philippines and the Philippines to him in a way that no institutional obligation could replicate. He was making himself into a symbol of resistance, of return, of the American promise that the Japanese conquest was temporary and that the men who had been left behind on Bataan and Corregidor will be honored by the liberation that was coming. The promise was also, in a very practical sense, a strategic commitment that would shape the entire Pacific War. Because MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines, made in March 1942, when the United States had no clear path back to those islands and no clear timeline for when a path might exist, became a political and military fact that constrained American strategic planning for the next 2.5 years. You could not tell Douglas MacArthur that the Philippines were not the primary objective of the Pacific Campaign. You could not tell him that bypassing the Philippines in favor of a more direct route to Japan, through the Central Pacific, as Nimitz and the Navy preferred, was a strategically superior choice. He would not accept it. He would not accept it institutionally. He would not accept it in his communications with Washington, and he would not accept it in the specific, relentless, theatrical way that Douglas MacArthur did not accept things. This is the story of the general who ignored Washington when it suited him, who made promises that forced strategic decisions that might not otherwise have been made, who conducted a campaign of breathtaking operational creativity across the Southwest Pacific, while simultaneously conducting a campaign of institutional politics in Washington that was almost as sophisticated as anything he did in the field. It is a story about genius and ego and the specific way that the two are not as separable in military command as the institutional framework would prefer. Before I go further, I want to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already. This series is about the people behind the famous decisions, the specific human beings whose specific qualities determine how the war was actually fought. Subscribe now and share this with someone who should be watching. Back to MacArthur. Back to 1942 and the man who turned a personal promise into a strategic imperative. The institutional politics of the Pacific War, the running battle between MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area Command and Admiral King's Navy for resources, strategic priority, and the dominant role in the final approach to Japan, is one of the less celebrated but most consequential dimensions of the Allied war effort in the Pacific. The inter-service rivalry that characterized American military planning throughout the war was nowhere more acute than in the Pacific, where two commands of roughly equal institutional weight were advancing toward the same objective by different routes and competing for the same finite pool of ships, aircraft, and men. MacArthur's relationship with Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the Pacific Ocean areas and whose Central Pacific Drive was the primary alternative to MacArthur's Southwest Pacific approach, was complex and not without its moment of genuine mutual respect, but was also fundamentally competitive in ways that shaped strategic decision-making throughout the war. Nimitz was, by temperament, a more conciliatory figure than MacArthur, less theatrical, less given to institutional combat, more willing to find accommodation. But he was also defending the Navy's institutional interest in the Central Pacific Drive with the same persistence that MacArthur was defending the Army's interest in the Southwest Pacific approach, and the two interests were not easily reconciled. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, who were supposed to resolve these competing interests through the unified strategic direction of the war, found MacArthur particularly difficult to manage. He had the ability to go outside institutional channels, to communicate directly with Congress, with the press, and with the public in ways that generated political pressure on the administration that other generals either lacked or chose not to use. His specific talent for self-promotion and his specific willingness to use public opinion as a strategic tool meant that fighting with MacArthur over strategic priorities was not simply an institutional argument. It was a political argument that could reach the front pages of American newspapers and become a factor in domestic politics. The relationship between MacArthur and Roosevelt was particularly complex. Roosevelt found MacArthur difficult. He described him, in a conversation with Harold Ikes, as one of the two most dangerous men in America, but he also respected his military talent and understood the political reality that MacArthur's public standing made him impossible to marginalize. The decision to rescue MacArthur from the Philippines in March 1942, rather than leaving him to be captured, was partly a military judgment about the value of his talent, and partly a political judgment about the consequences of allowing a general of his public stature to fall into Japanese hands. Either way, it created the conditions for the next 3 years of MacArthur's warfare against both Japan and the institutional constraints of his own command structure. The specific operational innovations that MacArthur and his command developed over the course of the Southwest Pacific Campaign deserve recognition alongside the institutional politics, because the politics can make it easy to lose sight of the genuine military achievement. The combination of land, sea, and air power that MacArthur's command developed, the specific coordination between ground forces, naval forces, and General Kenny's air forces that made the New Guinea campaign possible, was one of the most sophisticated examples of joint operations that the war produced. George Kenny was perhaps the single most important contributor to MacArthur's operational success, and his story is one of the more instructive in the Pacific War about what happens when the right person is placed in the right role at the right time. When Kenny arrived in the Southwest Pacific in August 1942, he found an air force that was demoralized, poorly led, and using tactics that were not adapted to the specific conditions of Pacific warfare. He rebuilt it over MacArthur's frequent interference, since MacArthur's understanding of air power was essentially that of a ground general who wanted aircraft to behave like artillery, into one of the most effective tactical air forces of the war. Kenny's specific innovations, the skip bombing technique that his low-level attack aircraft used to sink Japanese ships with extraordinary effectiveness, the parachute fragmentation bombs that allowed his aircraft to attack Japanese airfields at low altitude without destroying their own aircraft in the explosion, the specific coordination between his fighters and his bombers that gave his air force a tactical advantage over the Japanese forces opposing it, were the product of a commander who understood both the possibilities and the limitations of his equipment, and who was willing to experiment with tactics that had not been tried before. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea in March 1943, in which Kenny's aircraft destroyed a Japanese convoy of 8 transports and 4 destroyers carrying reinforcements to New Guinea, killing approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors, was the most dramatic single demonstration of the Southwest Pacific Air Force's capabilities, and it effectively ended Japan's ability to reinforce its New Guinea garrison through conventional convoy operations. After the Bismarck Sea, Japanese reinforcement of New Guinea had to be conducted by submarine or by small vessels running at night, which was far less efficient than convoy operations, and which meant that the Japanese forces MacArthur was facing were progressively weakened as the campaign advanced. The relationship between the air campaign and the ground campaign in the Southwest Pacific was more integrated than the European theater's approach to the same problem, partly because MacArthur's command faced the specific challenge of maintaining air superiority over the vast distances of the Pacific without the network of established airfields that the European theater possessed. Every advance in the ground campaign required the establishment of new airfields that could support the next advance, and every advance in the air campaign required the ground forces to secure the terrain on which the airfields could be built. The Seabees and the Army engineers who built those airfields, often under fire, often in terrain and conditions of extraordinary difficulty, were as essential to MacArthur's campaign as the combat units that cleared the terrain for them. The specific geography of the New Guinea campaign, the mountains, the rivers, the impenetrable jungle, the climate that was hostile to all military operations regardless of which side was conducting them, provided a context in which the specific qualities of MacArthur's approach were tested and demonstrated. The advance along the coast was not possible through the interior. The terrain made it militarily prohibitive. It had to be conducted by sea, supported by air, in a series of operations that each required careful coordination between multiple arms. The fact that MacArthur managed this coordination consistently over 2 years, advancing more than 2,000 miles against determined Japanese resistance, is a genuine military achievement that his institutional conflicts and his personal failings should not be allowed to obscure. The liberation of the Philippines, which was a culmination of the Southwest Pacific Campaign and fulfillment of the promise, was also the point at which the specific tensions of MacArthur's command style were most visible and most costly. The campaign to liberate Luzon, which consumed the first half of 1945, was conducted with the same operational creativity that had characterized the New Guinea campaign, but against a Japanese defense that was more organized and more determined than anything MacArthur had faced in New Guinea. The Japanese commander, General Tomoyuki Yamashita, who had captured Singapore in 1942 and who was probably the most capable Japanese ground commander in the Pacific, had organized the defense of Luzon in depth, with the specific intention of tying down American forces for as long as possible and inflicting the maximum possible casualties. Yamashita's strategy was largely successful in its own terms. The campaign for Luzon lasted from January to August 1945, when the Japanese surrender made its conclusion moot. American casualties were substantial, and the Filipino civilian population paid an enormous price in the fighting and in the Japanese reprisals against communities that had supported or were suspected of supporting the American advance. The specific decision about how aggressively pursue the campaign, how much risk to accept for speed, how much to protect civilian populations against the cost of rapid advance, was MacArthur's, and the historical verdict on his specific choices in this campaign is more contested than his defenders have typically acknowledged. The MacArthur who waited ashore at Leyte in October 1944 and declared "I have returned" was performing the specific kind of theater that he had always performed. The carefully staged, carefully photographed, carefully scripted moment that expressed who he understood himself to be and what he understood himself to have accomplished. The staging of the Leyte landing, the decision to wait ashore rather than arriving by boat at a prepared landing facility, the specific positioning of the cameras, the specific words of the speech, was not accidental. It was MacArthur doing what MacArthur did, which was to make history as much as to make war. But behind the theater was the substance. He had covered more than 2,000 miles. He had defeated or bypassed a Japanese force that had contested every step of the advance. He had built an air force from essentially nothing into one of the most effective tactical aviation forces of the war. He had organized and conducted a series of amphibious operations of growing complexity and ambition. And he had returned to the Philippines, not because it was a strategically optimal decision according to any particular operational analysis, but because he had promised to, and because the promise mattered to the people who had been waiting for it, and because the keeping of promises even inconvenient ones, is itself a kind of strategic asset that the operational analysis cannot fully capture. He had returned. That was a fact. What it cost, what it was worth, what it might have cost and been worth if the promise had not been made. These are the questions that his war poses, and that his war cannot fully answer. The war ended in August 1945, and Douglas MacArthur accepted the Japanese surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. He said, "These proceedings are closed." And they were. The war that he fought for 3.5 years, across 2,000 miles of the most difficult terrain in the world, in service of a promise that he made on a beach in Adelaide in March of 1942, was over. He had come through. He had returned. Old soldiers never die. They kept that promise too. The specific human beings who lived through the consequences of MacArthur's decisions. The Filipino civilians who endured Japanese occupation while waiting for the return that had been promised. The American and Filipino soldiers who fought and died in the liberation campaign. The Japanese soldiers who defended the Philippines in a doomed cause represent the human content of the strategic debate that military historians tend to conduct in the language of operational analysis. The Filipino experience of the Japanese occupation is a story that American histories of the Pacific War tend to compress into the background of the MacArthur narrative, but it was 3 years of genuine brutality for the Filipino population. The Japanese military occupation of the Philippines was not a benign administration. It involved mass executions, forced labor, the suppression of resistance through violence, and the specific atrocities that characterized Japanese military conduct across the occupied territories. The Bataan Death March, the forced march of approximately 76,000 American and Filipino prisoners from the tip of the Bataan Peninsula to prison camps in the interior, during which thousands died from execution, disease, and the deliberate denial of water and food, was the opening act of an occupation that lasted until 1944 and 1945. The Filipino resistance movements that operated throughout the occupation. The guerrilla networks that maintained contact with MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, that provided intelligence about Japanese dispositions and movements, that sustained the symbolic presence of American commitment to the liberation that had been promised, were real and consequential, and their contribution to the eventual liberation is not adequately recognized in most popular accounts. The Filipinos who maintained their resistance at the cost of reprisals against their communities were acting on a promise that MacArthur had made, and the specific force of that promise, its personal character, its first-person singular commitment, was part of what sustained the resistance through 3 years of occupation. The Japanese occupation forces understood the political significance of MacArthur's promise, and they made specific efforts to exploit it. Japanese propaganda throughout the occupation featured the theme that MacArthur was not coming back, that the promise was empty, that the United States had abandoned the Philippines, that the future of the Philippines lay within the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that Japan was constructing across the Pacific. The resistance that persisted despite this propaganda, that maintained its faith in the return that had been promised, was a specific human phenomenon that the strategic debate about whether the Philippines were a necessary objective tends to leave out of calculation. The specific soldiers who fought in the liberation campaign, the men of the 6th Army and 8th Army who came ashore at Leyte in October 1944, and who fought to Luzon and the other islands through the spring of 1945, experienced a campaign that was shaped by the terrain, the weather, and the Japanese defense in ways that the strategic debate does not fully capture. The Philippines are not small islands. Luzon alone is larger than the state of Ohio. The campaign to liberate Luzon was not a series of amphibious assaults against isolated Pacific atolls. It was a sustained ground campaign against a determined Japanese force of more than 200,000 men, fought across mountains and jungles and urban terrain, and it produced American casualties that exceeded those of the entire Central Pacific island hopping campaign. The Battle of Manila in February and March of 1945 was the most costly urban battle of the Pacific War, and one of the most costly urban battles in the history of American arms. The Japanese commander had declared Manila an open city and ordered his forces to withdraw, but the Japanese naval forces in the city refused the order and chose to fight from the buildings and the streets and the fortified compounds until there was nothing left to fight from. The resulting battle reduced much of the historic city to rubble, killed over 100,000 Filipino civilians who were caught between the two forces, and required the American forces to advance block by block to what had been one of the most beautiful and most historically significant cities in Asia. MacArthur's specific contribution to the civilian casualties of Manila is a historical question that has received increasing attention in recent decades. His insistence on capturing Manila quickly, his initial restrictions on the use of heavy artillery to reduce civilian casualties in the historic buildings, restrictions that were eventually lifted as the battle dragged on, and the specific decisions about how to conduct the urban battle were all factors in the specific character of the destruction. The full accounting of Manila's destruction and the role of MacArthur's decisions in it is more complex than the heroic narrative of liberation typically acknowledges. The parallel story of what was happening in Japan during the Philippines campaign, the deterioration of the Japanese strategic position, the growing awareness within the Japanese leadership that the war was being lost, the specific political and military dynamics that were building toward the August 1945 surrender, provides a context within which the Philippines campaign must ultimately be assessed. Japan in late 1944 and early 1945 was a country whose industrial base was being systematically destroyed by the B-29 bombing campaign from the Marianas, whose merchant fleet was being decimated by American submarines, and whose military forces were being ground down across multiple theaters without the possibility of replacement. The Japanese decision to fight for the Philippines with the forces committed to its defense, forces that could arguably have been used more effectively in the defense of the home islands, was itself a strategic choice that contributed to the final outcome. Japan chose to defend the Philippines because the Philippines were a critical node in the supply lines to Southeast Asian oil, and because losing them without fighting would have been politically and institutionally impossible for the Japanese military establishment to accept. The result was that the Philippines campaign consumed Japanese military resources at a rate that accelerated the broader strategic deterioration. Whether the Philippines needed to be liberated to achieve this result, whether the strategic deterioration of Japan's position would have occurred without the specific Philippines campaign, is precisely the question that cannot be answered definitively. The oil supply lines to Japan from Southeast Asia could have been cut by submarines and air power operating from other bases. The Japanese forces committed to the Philippines could not have changed the outcome of the war elsewhere if they had been redeployed, given the state of Japanese logistics in 1944 and 1945. The Philippines campaign consumed Japanese resources that were already consumed in a military sense. There was no realistic scenario in which those resources were available for decisive use elsewhere. This analysis, if correct, suggests that the Philippines campaign was a strategic sideshow, valuable in the specific sense that it kept Japanese forces engaged and destroyed them, but not decisive in the way that MacArthur claimed and in the way that the promise he had made seemed to require. The decisive factors in the defeat of Japan were the submarine campaign, the strategic bombing from the Marianas, the Soviet entry into Pacific War, and ultimately the atomic bombs. The Philippines campaign was important in the Pacific War. It was not the decisive element. MacArthur characteristically disagreed. He believed throughout the war and afterward that his Southwest Pacific campaign was a primary instrument of Japan's defeat, and he expressed this belief with the specific certainty that characterizes every conviction. The evidence suggests a more modest verdict. The Southwest Pacific campaign was a significant and well-executed contribution to the Allied victory in the Pacific, conducted with impressive operational creativity and genuine strategic effect, and shaped in important ways by a personal promise that may or may not have been strategically necessary, but that was morally and politically significant. The specific question of whether MacArthur's disobedience of Washington's strategic preferences, his persistent refusal to accept a strategy that did not include the liberation of the Philippines as its primary objective, was justified by the results is the question on which the MacArthur verdict ultimately turns. If you believe the Philippines' liberation was necessary, or was worth its cost in terms of the political commitment it represented and the Filipino population it relieved, then MacArthur's strategic advocacy was correct even if it was institutionally irregular. If you believe the Philippines could have been bypassed without significant strategic costs, and that the liberation campaign consumed resources that could have ended the war sooner, then MacArthur's advocacy was a self-interested distortion of strategic decision-making that extended the war and increased its casualties. The truth is probably somewhere between these two positions, as it usually is in complex historical questions. The Philippines' liberation was not purely necessary in a narrow military sense, but it was not purely optional either. The political and moral dimensions of the promise mattered. the effect of liberation on Filipino-American relations mattered, and the specific destruction of the Japanese forces in the Philippines mattered for the subsequent stages of the Pacific War. MacArthur's advocacy for the liberation was shaped by his personal commitment and his institutional interests, but it was not without genuine strategic logic. What can be said with confidence is that the MacArthur War, the Southwest Pacific Campaign from 1942 to 1945, and the specific character of that campaign, was one of the most distinctive military achievements of the Second World War, and that it was distinctive in ways that reflected the specific character of the man who commanded it. The creativity, the aggression, the willingness to accept operational risk, the specific theatrical quality that MacArthur brought to everything he did. These qualities shaped the campaign in ways that a different commander would not have shaped it. Whether a different campaign would have been better is a question that the history cannot answer. What the history can show is what MacArthur actually did, and what it actually cost, and what it actually achieved. He advanced from Australia to the Philippines in 3 years. He kept his promise. He waited ashore at Leyte and said he had returned. The men who had been waiting for the return, the Filipinos who had maintained their resistance through 3 years of brutal occupation on the basis of that promise, were there to receive it. That matters. That is part of the historical accounting too. Not the only part, but a real part, and one that the strategic analysis cannot quantify, but cannot ignore. I have returned. He did. Douglas MacArthur was 61 years old when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. He had been in the Philippines since 1935, having retired from the United States Army to serve as a field marshal of the Philippine Army, a role that allowed him to remain in the Pacific theater he had served in throughout his career, while also escaping the institutional frustrations of a peacetime American military that had not provided the advancement and the independent command that his talent and his ego both demanded. He had been recalled to active American service in July 1941, as the Japanese threat in the Pacific became impossible to ignore, and was placed in command of the U.S. Army forces in the Far East. His performance in defense of the Philippines in the weeks after Pearl Harbor was, to put it diplomatically, mixed. He had failed to disperse his aircraft before the Japanese attacks of December 8th, a failure that resulted in the destruction of most of his air power on the ground. Despite having received 9 hours of warning after Pearl Harbor, he had initially tried to defend all of Luzon rather than immediately executing the pre-war plan that called for retreating to Bataan Peninsula and holding there until relief could arrive. He had spent much of the Bataan campaign on the island fortress of Corregidor, visiting the front only once, in circumstances that earned him the unflattering nickname Dugout Doug from the men who were fighting in the jungle while their commanding general was in a fortified bunker. And yet he was also, undeniably, one of the most gifted operational commanders of his generation. The contradiction between the failures of the Philippines and the subsequent brilliance of the Southwest Pacific Campaign is not comfortable, and it does not resolve cleanly. MacArthur was simultaneously a man of genuine military genius and a man of genuine human weakness, of vanity, of self-promotion, of a willingness to shape the historical record in his own favor that modern historians have had to work to correct. Both things are true, and the full MacArthur requires holding both. The Southwest Pacific Campaign that MacArthur commanded from 1942 to 1945 is one of the most creative and successful campaigns in American military history, starting from Australia with limited resources, always, throughout the campaign, fighting for resources against priority that the Navy and Nimitz's Central Pacific Drive was receiving. MacArthur advanced along the northern coast of New Guinea in a series of amphibious operations that bypassed and isolated Japanese forces with consistency and a creativity that was genuinely extraordinary. The specific technique he developed, which became known as leapfrogging, though MacArthur himself called it advancing by hit 'em where they ain't, involved using naval and air power to establish superiority at specific points along the coast, then landing forces at those points to establish bases that could support the next leap forward, bypassing the Japanese garrisons that were between the points he selected. The bypassed garrisons would be cut off from supply, left to wither, and simply left as the advance moved past them. It was the same concept that Nimitz was applying in the Central Pacific, but MacArthur applied it along the coast of a large landmass rather than across open ocean, which created different tactical and logistical problems and required different solutions. The New Guinea campaign of 1943 and 1944, the series of operations that took MacArthur's forces from Port Moresby to Hollandia and eventually to Leyte covered more than 2,000 miles of some of the most difficult terrain in the world. The jungle, the mountains, the rivers, the climate. All of these were obstacles that the campaign had to overcome in addition to the Japanese military forces that were trying to stop it. The speed of the advance, faster, in terms of distance covered per month, than any comparable Allied operation in either theater, reflected the specific creativity of MacArthur's approach and the specific quality of the forces he was commanding. The relationship between MacArthur and his subordinate commanders, particularly his relationship with General Walter Kruger, who commanded the 6th Army that executed most of the ground operations, and with General George Kenney, who built and commanded the Allied air forces in the Southwest Pacific, was one of the more functional relationships in the American military establishment of the war. MacArthur gave his subordinates clear strategic objectives and then largely left them to figure out how to achieve them. He was demanding, impossibly demanding by most accounts, but he was also willing to trust the people he had placed in command positions, which is not always true of generals of his temperament and ego. The exception to this pattern was his relationship with the Navy and with the Navy's senior commanders. MacArthur had a deep and persistent institutional contempt for the Navy that expressed itself in a running battle over resources and strategic direction that lasted throughout the war. He believed and argued persistently to Washington and to anyone else who would listen that the Central Pacific Drive was strategically inferior to his Southwest Pacific approach, that the Navy was empire building at the expense of strategic sense, and that Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations, was using the Pacific War to advance the Navy's institutional interests at the expense of the armies. Some of these arguments had merit. The debate between the Southwest Pacific and Central Pacific approaches to Japan was a genuine strategic debate with real arguments on both sides. The Southwest Pacific route through the Philippines to Formosa offered certain advantages: proximity to Allied bases in Australia, the opportunity to liberate a large and politically significant American territory, the potential to cut Japan's supply lines to Southeast Asian oil through the Philippines. The Central Pacific route to the Marianas offered different advantages: shorter distances, the potential for more direct advance toward Japan, the opportunity to establish bases for the B-29 bombing campaign. Washington's eventual resolution of this debate, the July 1944 decision at Pearl Harbor that MacArthur attended in person, at which he argued directly and forcefully for the Philippines route, is one of the pivotal strategic decisions of the Pacific War. MacArthur's argument was effective not just because of his military logic, but because of its political and personal force. He argued that abandoning the Philippines, bypassing them in favor of a more direct route to Japan, as King and some of the Navy planners preferred, would be a betrayal of the Filipino people who fought alongside American forces and who rely on the promise that MacArthur had made. He argued that the American public would not accept a strategy that left the Philippines in Japanese hands, while the war was ended by bombing Japan into submission from the Marianas. He was right about the politics, even if the purely military arguments were less clear-cut. Roosevelt made the decision to support the Philippines operation, and the invasion of Leyte in October 1944 was a result. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, followed immediately as the Japanese committed their entire remaining fleet to stopping the landings, and the battle's outcome effectively ended Japanese naval power in the Pacific. MacArthur waded ashore at Leyte Beach and said, into the microphones that had been arranged for the purpose, "People of the Philippines, I have returned." He had returned. The promise made in Adelaide in March 1942 had been kept. Whether it needed to be kept, whether the Philippines were a strategic necessity or a personal commitment that had been elevated to strategic priority by the force of MacArthur's personality and his political influence, remains one of the open questions of the Pacific War. The liberation of the Philippines was one of the costliest campaigns of the Pacific Theater. The Battle for Luzon, which MacArthur launched in January 1945, was the largest ground operation in the Pacific War. The Battle for Manila, fought street by street to the Philippine capital, with Filipino civilians caught between the American forces advancing and the Japanese defenders refusing to surrender, produced more than 100,000 Filipino civilian deaths and the near total destruction of one of the most beautiful cities in Asia. The Japanese defense was fanatical, as Japanese defenses throughout the Pacific had been, but it was also made more costly than it needed to be by MacArthur's insistence on liberating the entire Philippines rather than accepting a more limited objective. The broader question that MacArthur's campaign raises, the question of what was gained by the Philippines' liberation that could not have been gained through a more direct approach to Japan, is one that military historians have discussed at length without reaching a definitive conclusion. The Philippines provided bases for air operations against Japan and for the final advance that would have been necessary if the atomic bombs had not ended the war. They demonstrated American commitment to the Filipino people and the American promises of liberation. They destroyed a large Japanese force that would otherwise have been available for the defense of the home islands. Whether these gains were worth the specific cost of the campaign, in American and Filipino lives, in time, in resources that might have been applied elsewhere, is a calculation that different historians have made differently. What is not in dispute is that the Philippines campaign and the decision conducted was shaped in fundamental ways by the specific personal commitment that Douglas MacArthur had made in March 1942, and by the specific political and institutional force with which he had sustained and pressed that commitment over the following 2.5 years. The campaign was, in a very real sense, MacArthur's war, shaped by his promise, sustained by his advocacy, executed by his army, and concluded with him waiting ashore at the beaches he had promised to return to. The subsequent history of MacArthur's career, his command of the occupation of Japan, his conduct of the Korean War, his relief by Truman in April 1951 for insubordination after he publicly contradicted the administration's strategic direction, is a continuation of the same pattern. MacArthur consistently believed that his military judgment was superior to the institutional framework in which he operated, and he consistently acted on that belief in ways that created institutional crises. Truman's relief of MacArthur was constitutionally necessary. A general who publicly advocates for a different strategy than the one his commander-in-chief has ordered is a fundamental violation of civilian control of the military, and was also an enormous political risk, because MacArthur returned to the United States as a hero and was greeted by crowds in several cities. His famous farewell address to Congress, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," was one of the most effective pieces of political theater of the post-war era. It did not reverse Truman's decision, which was right, but it demonstrated that MacArthur's capacity for self-dramatization had not diminished with age. He was 71 when he was relieved. He had been in the Army for half a century. He was not going to fade quietly. The specific legacy of MacArthur's Pacific War Command is genuinely complicated, more complicated than the hero worship that characterized his public reception, and more complicated than the debunking that some revisionist historians have attempted. He was a general of genuine operational genius who used that genius to advance a campaign that had real strategic value, and who also used his personality and his political connections to shape American strategic decisions in ways that were not always the best available choices. He was a man who kept a promise to a people who needed to believe the promise would be kept, and who paid a price in lives and resources to keep it that others would argue was too high. He was a general who conducted one of the most creative military campaigns in American history, and who also manipulated the historical record of his own performance in ways that subsequent historians have had to work to correct. He arrived in the Philippines in 1944, as he had promised. He waited ashore at Leyte in the theatrical way that the photographs had already been arranged to capture. He said, "I have returned." And it was true. He had returned, whether returning was necessary, whether it was the right choice, whether the promise that bound him to return was a strategic asset or a strategic constraint. These are the questions that MacArthur's war poses and does not fully answer. He died in 1964 at 84 at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. He is buried at Norfolk, Virginia, in a memorial that bears his name. The Philippines that he promised to return to are today an independent nation, allied with the United States, carrying their own complicated relationship to the history of American military presence on their soil. The promise was kept. The accounting of what keeping it costs is still being done. The specific legacy of Douglas MacArthur in American military and political culture, and in Filipino culture, which has a complicated and ongoing relationship with the MacArthur story, is worth examining as a final dimension of the MacArthur War. In the United States, MacArthur's legacy has been shaped by a series of competing narratives that have never fully resolved. The heroic narrative, the general who never gave up, who kept his promise, who liberated the Philippines and accepted the Japanese surrender, dominated the immediate post-war period and was reinforced by MacArthur's own considerable talent for self-promotion. His return from the Korean War in 1951 and his famous speech to Congress, "Old soldiers never die, they just fade away," was one of the most effective pieces of political theater of the post-war era. The critical narrative, the general who manipulated strategic decision-making for personal reasons, who extended the war with a costly Philippines campaign, who insubordinated his commander-in-chief in Korea and had to be removed, emerged more slowly as military historians gained access to the records and began the work of reconstructing what had actually happened rather than what MacArthur had told them happened. The specific distortions in the official record of the Philippines campaign, the systematic inflation of casualties inflicted, the revision of dates and events, the suppression of information that reflected poorly on MacArthur's performance, are documented in the scholarly literature and constitute a genuine blemish on his historical record. The honest verdict lies between the hero and the villain, as it almost always does with figures of this complexity. MacArthur was a general of genuine operational genius, whose talent was real and whose campaign was a real achievement. He was also a man of enormous vanity and political ambition, whose institutional behavior created costs and complications that the war effort could have done without. Both things are true, and the full MacArthur requires holding both. In the Philippines, the MacArthur legacy is even more complicated. He is honored there. The MacArthur Memorial in Manila, the streets and places that bear his name, the specific reverence for the general who returned, and he is also, in other Filipino voices, a more ambiguous figure. The specific cost of the liberation, the civilian deaths of Manila, the destruction of the city, the years of occupation that preceded the return, are part of the Filipino memory of the MacArthur War that the heroic narrative tends to minimize. The Filipinos who waited for the return, who maintained their resistance through 3 years of brutal occupation on the basis of the promise that had been made, were real people whose lives were shaped by the promise and by its fulfillment. The Filipino civilians who died in the Battle of Manila were also real people whose deaths were part of the cost of keeping the promise. The Filipino veterans of the resistance who fought alongside American forces and who were denied veterans' benefits by the United States government after the war, a political decision that MacArthur did not oppose with the force that his institutional position might have allowed, represent another dimension of the MacArthur legacy that the heroic narrative does not fully acknowledge. The specific judgment of history on Douglas MacArthur is that he was one of the most complex figures in American military history, a commander of genuine brilliance and genuine ego, of real achievement and real failure, of theatrical promise-keeping and institutional self-interest, who conducted one of the most distinctive campaigns of the Second World War, and whose legacy is still being argued over 80 years later. The War in the Pacific, which MacArthur understood as his war, his theater, his campaign, ended with Japan's surrender in Tokyo Bay. He accepted that surrender with the same theatrical precision that characterized everything he did, and he presided over the subsequent occupation of Japan with a paternalistic authority that rebuilt the country in ways that his Japanese subjects found alien and effective in roughly equal measure. He was, in his way, the right person for the occupation as well as for the war, an imperial personality presiding over a post-war order that required both American authority and American generosity, and that MacArthur provided in his own specific way. He came through, he returned, he accepted the surrender, he ran the occupation, and then, at 71, he was fired by a president who was constitutionally right to fire him, and he went home to America and gave his speech about old soldiers and began the long process of becoming history. He is history now. The Philippines are independent. Japan is an ally. The Pacific is an American lake in the strategic sense that the war established. And the specific question that his war poses, whether the promise that he made in March 1942 was a strategic asset or a strategic constraint, whether the Philippines campaign was necessary or simply necessary for Douglas MacArthur, remains, like most honest historical questions, permanently open. I came through. I shall return. He did both. The specific moment of the Japanese surrender on September 2nd, 1945, which MacArthur orchestrated with the same precision and theatrical sensibility that he brought to everything in his career, is worth examining as a final expression of who MacArthur was and what he understood the war to have meant. The ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri was MacArthur's production in the most literal sense. He had insisted on a Japanese warship as the venue, had arranged a specific positioning of the Allied representatives, had determined the order of signing, and had written the speech he delivered as personally as any document of his career. The speech was good, genuinely good, measured and reflective in ways that his more operationally focused communications rarely achieved. He spoke of the holy mission of a better world and the need to rise to the height of a new moral order. He was, in the specific moment of surrender, precisely the figure he had always wanted to be, the supreme Allied commander in the Pacific, accepting the formal end of the war that he had spent 3.5 years fighting. The Japanese representatives who signed the surrender document, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yashijiro Yumizu, the chiefs who represented the imperial government and the imperial military, did so in the specific posture of men who had no choice. Japan had been destroyed as a military power. Its cities had been bombed. Its fleet had been sunk. Its army had been beaten across 2,000 miles of ocean. Its people were starving. The atomic bombs that had fallen on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had removed the last theoretical possibility of continued resistance. The surrender was not negotiated. It was received. MacArthur's management of the subsequent occupation, his transformation of Japan from a defeated enemy into an ally, his dismantling of the militarist institutions that had driven the country to war, his oversight of the drafting of the Japanese constitution that established the parliamentary democracy that Japan has maintained at present, is a chapter of his career that is less celebrated than the military campaign, but that may, in the long run, be more consequential. The Japan that exists today, democratic, pacifist, prosperous, allied with the United States, was shaped in fundamental ways by the 5 years of MacArthur's occupation and the specific decisions he made during that period about how to rebuild the country and what to preserve of its institutions. His decision to preserve the emperor, to use the imperial institution as a symbol of continuity and social stability rather than prosecuting Hirohito as a war criminal, was the most consequential single decision of the occupation. And it was a decision that MacArthur made over the objections of some of his Allied partners and on the basis of his own assessment of what was necessary for the occupation to succeed. Whether the decision was right, whether Hirohito's personal responsibility for the war crimes committed under his formal authority should have been prosecuted, is a historical question that has not been fully resolved. What is clear is that the decision was consequential, and that it was MacArthur's, and that it shaped the subsequent trajectory of Japan's political development in ways that are still visible today. The Korean War interrupted the occupation and produced the final chapter of MacArthur's career, the Incheon Landing, which was one of the most audacious and successful amphibious operations in military history, followed by the catastrophic advance toward the Yalu River that brought China into the war, followed by the relief by Truman that ended his active military career. The Incheon Landing was pure MacArthur, a plan that the Joint Chiefs considered near suicidal, against the advice of virtually all of his naval and military advisors, executed with the specific confidence of a man who had been right about unconventional operations before and who was certain he was right again. He was right. The landing succeeded, and the North Korean forces were cut off, and the war was effectively won within weeks of the landing. The advance toward the Yalu was also pure MacArthur. The overconfidence, the dismissal of intelligence that did not fit a preferred picture, the specific failure to adequately consider the Chinese intervention that the intelligence was warning about. The disaster that followed, when 200,000 Chinese troops crossed the Yalu and drove the Allied forces back in the largest retreat in American military history, was a product of the same qualities that had produced the Incheon triumph. The willingness to accept risk, the confidence that bordered on recklessness, the specific belief that his judgment was superior to any contrary evidence. The Korean War ended MacArthur's career and produced his most famous public moment. The farewell speech, "Old soldiers never die. They just fade away." And then he did fade away. Not entirely, not all at once, but inexorably, as the years passed and the world moved on from the war that had defined him. He attended the 1952 Republican Convention, briefly sought the Republican presidential nomination, and then gradually became a figure of the past rather than the present. He died in 1964 at 84 in the Waldorf Astoria, attended by the specific pomp and circumstance that it always required. His war, the Southwest Pacific Campaign, the promise and the return, The 2,000 miles from Australia to Manila stands as one of the most extraordinary military achievements in American history, conducted by one of the most complicated human beings ever to hold high command. He was brilliant and vain, creative and self-serving, genuinely committed to the people he had promised to liberate, and genuinely willing to pay their price in blood to keep the promise. He was, in all of these dimensions simultaneously, exactly the kind of general that war produces, and that peace cannot fully accommodate. Old soldiers never die. Douglas MacArthur never fully died in the public memory because his war was too dramatic and his personality too large to simply dissolve into history. He is still argued about. He is still complicated. He is still, 80 years later, exactly as difficult to assess as he was when he was alive. He came through. He returned. These proceedings are closed. The broader question of what MacArthur's Pacific War tells us about the relationship between military genius and institutional authority is one that has applications beyond the specific history of the Second World War. The tension between the commander who sees what needs to be done and the institution that has to manage the full complexity of a coalition war, the tension between the specific insight and the broader coordination, is permanent in large-scale military operations, and MacArthur embodied it more completely than almost any other commander in American history. He was right about things that his institutional superiors were wrong about. The New Guinea campaign worked in the way he said it would. The Philippines' return was militarily and politically significant in ways that the purely operational analysis underestimated. The Incheon landing succeeded against the odds that the risk assessments had placed on it. These specific judgments, vindicated by outcomes, are the evidence for the position that MacArthur's willingness to act against institutional consensus was justified by results. He was also wrong about things where his institutional superior's caution was justified. The Philippines campaign was more costly than the advance through the Philippines advocates had projected. The advance to the Yalu was a kind of overreach that the cautious assessments of the intelligence community were trying to prevent. The Korean War's expansion after Incheon was a strategic disaster that the original limited war framework had been designed to avoid. These specific misjudgments, with their consequences in lives and strategic setbacks, are the evidence for a position that MacArthur's willingness to override institutional judgment was not reliably justified by superior insight. The honest verdict is that MacArthur's judgment was better than average but not infallible, that a specific combination of creativity, operational boldness, and willingness to accept risk produced more successes and failures, but also produced specific failures whose costs were real. This is not a remarkable finding. It is what you expect from any commander of extraordinary talent who also operates with extraordinary confidence. The question is whether the institutional framework can accommodate a commander of this profile, can channel the talent while preventing the overreach, and the American military's experience with MacArthur suggests that the answer is, with great difficulty and at great cost, and not always successfully. The specific cost that the American military system paid for MacArthur's career, the political capital expended in managing his conflicts with other commanders and with Washington, the strategic distortions produced by his institutional lobbying, the Korea disaster that resulted from insufficient institutional restraint on his operational judgment, was real. It was also, from the perspective of what MacArthur's talent contributed to the Allied victory in the Pacific, a cost that the system may have been right to pay. Great military talent does not come without cost. The management of Douglas MacArthur was expensive, institutionally and politically, and sometimes militarily. The campaign he commanded was also one of the most successful in American history. The two facts exist together, and the historical accounting requires holding both. He is buried at Norfolk, Virginia, in the MacArthur Memorial. The Philippines, he promised, to return to our independent and allied with a country that liberated them. Japan, which he occupied and rebuilt, is a democracy and one of the closest American allies in Asia. The Pacific theater of the Second World War, which he commanded from Australia to Tokyo Bay, is an American strategic sphere in ways that the pre-war Pacific was not. These are the outcomes of a war that MacArthur did not fight alone, that was fought by millions of men and women across years and thousands of miles, but that his specific contribution helped shape in ways that the accounting requires acknowledging. He was difficult. He was brilliant. He was vain. He was committed. He was complex. He was, in the end, the general that the Pacific War required, which does not mean he was a general that the Pacific War deserved, which is a different thing entirely. Old soldiers never die. He proved it for 84 years.